Okay, so welcome everyone. A very hearty and warm welcome to all of you. Thanks for taking the time again out of your busy schedules. I'm Rod Downing. Again, any technical questions you have, please direct them to myself. I'm going to introduce this session. This is a continuation of last week titled Climate Crises and Sacred Spaces, Our Campgrounds. Last week, we focused primarily on the problems of climate change on our campgrounds. This week, we want to examine the solutions. Two aspects. One will be how to adapt to the changes already baked in and also likely to occur. A second aspect is how to use our religious and creative imaginations to envision new expressions of ministry, such as centers of cultural renewal and ecological restoration. Within this creative imagination, brought into reality, lies our hope, grounded in God's good spirit, a leavening process. And so with that as an introduction, I'll turn it over to Lori and we will get started.
Unmute, Lori. Lori, you need to unmute.
All right, sorry. All right, well, I just was extending my welcome and thanks for all of you for taking time to join us on Sunday afternoon. We're going to return to northern Ethiopia, where for those of you who were with us last week, we kind of ended and did a little teaser. The word in Amharic, Cha'aka, means forest, wild, and mystery. The preservation of forests, especially old growth forests, is a major key to saving the planet in these times of climate crisis. Trees inhale carbon, transpire coolness and water, exhaling oxygen so that we too can breathe. The oldest, largest trees sequester carbon not only in their above ground mass, but deep into the soil through vast root and fungal networks. Healthy forests prevent runoff, allow water to infiltrate the ground, and keep springs from drying up in times of drought. Forests provide critical habitat, including for pollinators, critical for growing our food, and they're also a source of pharmaceuticals that support human health. So these are all good, strong, and utterly necessary reasons for protecting forest ecosystems, all ecosystems, planet-wide. But beyond the utilitarian, maybe there are even better reasons for us to act. Alimeyehu Wasi, an Ethiopian Orthodox scientist and forest ecologist that you are about to meet, says forests are really mystical, holy, and sacred places. Might we act to protect the spaces we hold sacred because, like Jacob, we wake up on a mountain and say, I didn't know it before, but now I know God is in this place. I want to remind you of the Emergence magazine that I recommended that this film that you're about to see comes from. It's a film by Jeremy Seifert. Okay. Okay, are you seeing the film?
Yes. And we're hearing it.
In Ethiopian Orthodox teaching, a church, to be a church, should be enveloped by a forest. It should resemble the Garden of Eden. A 100 years ago, the highland was one big continuous forest. That big continuous forest has been eaten up by agriculture. It is a church who has protected this forest and who has safeguarded them from destruction. It's only because of the patronage and the blessing of the church these forests have survived. Church forests are always in my childhood memory. I used to go with my family for Sunday Mass, for holidays. We have been always told that God gives mercy when you pray here. So the spiritual connectivity is so strong. The more I study them, the more I understand them, the more I see their problem, their importance, their significance, and then I end up being hooked with this forest, you know.
ስለዚህ በየእጽዋቶች ላይ የእግዚአብሔር ኃይል አለ፣ የእግዚአብሔር ጸጋ አለ፣ የእግዚአብሔር በረከት አለ። ስለዚህ አንዲትን ዛፍ የተከለ ሰው በተወዛወዘች ቁጥር እድሜውን ትለምንለታል ይችላል። ተተኪ ደኖችም ተተኪ ትውልድ እንደምናፈረው ሁላ የእጽዋት ተተኪ ትውልዶችም የሉ። ሲወጡ ገና ይበላቸዋል እያለቁ እነሱ ትልቁ ሲወድ ተተኪ ያጣና ደኑ ከንቱ ይሆናል። እና አጥሩ በጣም ጠቃሚ፣ ቤተክርስቲያናችን እሷን ካጣች ግን ራሷን ታጣለች።
The idea of making a wall to conserve the forest came from the church itself. If you see the rural church, they have a wall to protect the inner circle, which people think that's the most sacred place. So let's move that wall to the outside and include the forest as part of the church itself. We are making a barrier, not excluding humans, a barrier against cattle grazing, so that regeneration and the health of the forest can be sustained. The church has been protecting the forest for centuries. But the forest in turn has been a guardian. It was a kind of mutual benefiting. The church itself were built from this forest. The inner wall of the church has been painted, and all those pictures, scriptures and murals were made out of tree leaves, roots, barks and flowers 800, 700, even 1,000 years ago. They are living by one another. They are embedded to one another. The church is within the forest is inside the church. In ecological term, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. There are millions of other creatures. There is so complicated, sophisticated interaction you cannot explain. Because of the coexistence, there is what we call emergent property. It's a new hybrid character. The mystery is to think beyond what we see. There is a problem always, a misperception that this forest would stay forever. We don't have any other backup to safeguard the Ethiopian biodiversity. It is only the church forest. If we lose that, then that's all.
ያለቀ ከመሄድ እንዲድን አንዳንዴ ድንበሩም አይታወቅም። በተለይ ትውልድ ሲያልፍ ትልልቅ አባቶች ሲያልፍ ወጣቱ ጎረምሳ ገበሬ ሲመጣ ወደ ጥግ እየመጣ ያርሳል እና ያኔ ድንበሩ ይጠፋል እና ይሄ የድንጋዩ አጥር ዋናው ጥቅሙ ከብት እንዳይገባ።
The biggest challenge is to open the eyes of the community to show up these forests are really disappearing. They think always they are there forever. The church forests are the blueprint. You can understand what kind of ecosystem, what kind of biodiversity, what kind of forest we had before. Everything is important and interlinked. So if you really care, we have to respect trees, the role of trees, and we have to learn to live with forests. We can bring back the landscape given that these church forests exist. That's my hope, that's my vision.
YouTube. All right. So my apologies for the technical glitch, but also I hope that that film was worth watching and worth the technical glitch. All right. So this is a story about commitment to sacred spaces. It's a story about the possibility of ecological restoration and cultural renewal through the multiplication of many acts of prayer to heal the world with gestures of reverence, both large and difficult and small and everyday. Following God's commandment to keep and tend the earth In Genesis, the forests around these churches have been tended as sacred for at least 15 or 1600 years. They've been protected first because they're believed to house and shelter invisible hermits, holy men going about a quiet, hidden work of intercession, praying for the healing of the world. And it sounds like maybe some of the trees are joining those invisible hermits also praying. And as we heard at the very beginning of the film, a church, to be a church, should be enveloped by a forest. It should resemble the Garden of Eden. These remnants of a once vast ecosystem are truly a Noah's Ark of biodiversity. They contain endemic tree species and threatened wildlife that might, just might, seed the restoration of all that has been desecrated and lost. This much is for sure. Without the church, without the vision of her leaders, without the efforts of her people and their commitments, even the possibility of restoration and renewal would not exist. Fred Banson, the author of the essay that accompanies this film, describes the mystical geography of this sacred space. If you'll notice in the center, and then drawing on the traditions of Judaism, the center is called the Holy of Holies. Enclosing that sacred center is a larger circle where people receive communion, and outside that, still a larger circle, the chanting place. Its walls covered in those colorful, beautiful icons telling all the biblical stories. All three spheres are contained under that round church roof, and then those circles ripple outside the church building itself. There's a courtyard that's the length of 40 angels' arm spans to the inner wall. And then what the priest did was they created this outer wall. And I'm going to not go any further with that, but recommend the article to you about all the efforts that went into creating those walls. But Banson stands beside Zajor's walls and sees this series of concentric circles radiating outward, as though something sacred was a stone tossed onto the landscape and sending invisible ripples of holiness out into the world. I like to imagine our campgrounds that same way. Alameyehu's vision for restoration depends on this radiating concentric circles. It's not, because the churches have preserved these fragments of habitat, and there's something like 20,000 of these churches, of which 14 have been preserved. And they're at all different states of degradation and biodiversity. But Alameyehu hopes to save 40%, to restore 40% of the forest cover in his lifetime. He imagines the rippling expansion of all those fragments and imagines planting trees along the riverbeds that connect all the different church forests so that there will be wildlife corridors. Banson notices this. It's not really his dream so much as it's the land dreaming through him. Or maybe it's God dreaming through the land, which then rises up in the mind of one man and spreads a dream of what the land wants to become and will be again. By extending the boundaries of what they consider sacred, Banson says the Orthodox Christians of northern Ethiopia are not only protecting their own forests, they are offering us a pattern for how we can tap into our deep cultural knowing, our religious heritage, our spiritual traditions, our commitment to the enduring principle of the sacredness of creation. Let's put that memory to work on behalf of the web of life. Let's put our imagination to work on behalf of the web of life. So here's the question we're considering today. How might our sacred spaces become centers for world healing acts of prayer, cultural renewal, and ecological restoration? In the following few moments, you're going to hear 4 responses offered from team members to this question, revisiting the campgrounds impacted by climate change that we presented last week. And then it's going to be your turn to share what is just beginning to stir in your religious and spiritual imaginations, because they're powerful, in response to this question. You will hear, and we invite from you both, sort of expansive, visionary, think outside our usual box of responses to how we can make our sacred spaces these kinds of centers, and immediate, pragmatic, action-targeted responses that are necessary to get going on today to save our sacred spaces for the healing of Earth. So with that, I turn it over to Rod and Paul.
And firstly, I want to acknowledge the work of Dean White, who put all this together but couldn't be with us today. As we said last week, Samish Island is sacred to two peoples at least. Members and friends of the three mission centers of the Community of Christ, but historically, for a much longer time, to the Samish tribe and other indigenous coastal Salish peoples, including Lumi, Swinomish, Skolum, and Nooksack, to name a few. We mentioned it's at the center of an endangered ecosystem for many species: salmon, shellfish, orca, eagles, and other birds, and of course, us as humans. Last week, we talked about the impact of sea level rise on our Samish Island campground as a result of climate change. Without action, Samish Island is likely to become again a true island, separated by at least 3 miles from the mainland. Our lake that witnessed baptisms will again be a part of the tidal mudflats. But we are not powerless without hope. Today, we begin to discuss how our actions and our use of sacred spaces might help to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change in and around Samish Island. Part of the story centers around salmon. We saw that community feasts at salmon dinners has always been a church community tradition for decades, and is central to the indigenous cultures of the coast Salish peoples. But salmon runs are threatened. Warming oceans contribute to sea level rise, but river temperatures above 64 degrees Fahrenheit threatens salmon reproduction. Already, spring Chinook salmon runs have disappeared in many rivers. Listen to the story of the salmon people and their connection with the salmon ecosystem.
Really, it's about water. Our people tell us that we are actually born into water. We were water beings before we became human beings. Most of the indigenous people live along the oceans or rivers. They depend on water, they depend on the fish, for survival.
There was always fish here. It provided everything you needed to survive. It's where we drew our culture from. We almost grew around the salmon. And in that regard, we grew to respect something that provided so much for us.
Our relationship to the salmon started with the creation story. Before we were here, the animals met and decided that they needed to help us. And that's when salmon stepped forward and said, I will give myself. And that is when the ancient covenant started. And now our brother is suffering.
Water is considered the lifeblood of all living things. And the salmon needed to live, we needed to live. When we talk about forests or we talk about mining, we talk about the dam systems, and everything that happens to the water impacts everything within that system.
We're seeing a decline in this fishing. And what do? You got to do something. You got to make a choice. Because if you do nothing, it ends.
It's a good picture of our catch.
The salmon has such an interrelated connection in the ecosystem. They not only feed humans, they feed the four-legged, they feed the actual nutrients in the rivers, they feed the winged ones, eagles. If it's taken out of the equation, it'll have a ripple effect on the whole system. That's what we have to start thinking about, because that cycle gets interrupted, we have to do something about it.
Who are we without salmon? When we have big salmon runs and everybody has fish, everybody's happy when our smokehouse is full. But when we lose our water, when our salmon are declining, our people are unhealthy.
As long as we want to be Indian people and we want to honor our custom and traditions and our shilling, and it'll be a running battle all the time. As long as we want to be who we want to be, because we have a different view of the world. That's the challenge. We're trying to preserve a way of life, and fishing is vital to that.
So it's a part of our way of life. And without the salmon, we're missing a piece of who we are. We're not able to exercise what was guaranteed in our treaty of 1855, which was a way of life. And we bargained for that.
The treaty talks about the rights that our forefathers made sure were ensconced in the wording. But not only do we have the rights, but we have the responsibility so we can teach others about the old way that our people teach us about how everything is tied together.
The United States is a democratic form of government whose ideal is individual freedom, but primarily benefits capitalism and promotes selfishness and greed. But our tribal systems of government existed for thousands of years and is interwoven and connected to salmon and all living things.
What do we want? Justice! What do we want?
It's important to remember that in those treaties, our ancestors reserved our own rights. And those rights remain the supreme law of the land today.
You want to follow us? Here I go.
I believe that is the future of how we pull ourselves out of this climate crisis. I really hear a call to gather, to form an alliance of the salmon nations, to use our sovereignty as a collective force to rebuild our nations. So that's what we will do.
Imagine the opportunities for partnering with the tribes of the Coast Salish peoples to preserve and protect the ecosystem to which salmon survival is central. As the video depicts, there are many issues related to dam systems, sea and river water pollution, protection of forests, impacts of other species, enforcement of treaty rights, to name a few. A coalition of Coast Salish tribes has formed an institute to promote research and education about these issues. The Samish campgrounds might be a site for events sponsored by the Institute. In any case, there are many local groups in the Salish Sea area that are active on these issues, looking for people to join. Samish Island also forms the northern boundary of the Padilla Bay National Estuary Reserve. The website for the preserve offers many opportunities for people to join hands in an effort to protect this ecosystem. A related organization is the Padilla Bay Foundation. In this image, you can see Samish Island up in the left upper corner. Their website also offers many opportunities to get involved in the fight to mitigate the effects of climate change on that ecosystem. What thoughts do you have about the ways we can use campgrounds such as Samish Island to promote climate change mitigation and adaptation? What are your ideas or dreams for connecting our sacred spaces to the work of saving our planet for future generations?
So we'll post again the question, how might our sacred spaces become centers for world healing acts of prayer? We shared a few of the challenges that are facing some of our beloved Community of Christ campgrounds. This week, we are exploring not only solutions, but also to reimagine ways our campgrounds can be utilized for the well-being of all creation. As mentioned last week, our campgrounds are larger, have more land, can be shared by more people, and have more physical resources than any individual congregation or facility. A first step, we can review our campgrounds against the World Church checklist for green congregations. There are multiple items from this list that pertain to campgrounds, and a few of the major items include installing sources of renewable energy, solar panels, or wind turbines. We can consider replacing appliances with electric stoves, electric heat pumps, electric heat pump water heaters. And maybe we can add a new one, adding EV charging infrastructure for electric vehicles. The bootleg fire in July of last year ripped through the Winema and Fremont National Forests in Oregon. It burned for over a month, consuming nearly 500,000 acres. But when the fire approached the 30,000-acre Sycan Marsh Preserve, full of towering ponderosa pines, the fire surprisingly changed its behavior. The flames weakened and the fire slowed down. This brief lull allowed firefighters to move in and steer the blaze away from a critical research station they'd once given up for lost. The land belongs to the Nature Conservancy, an environmental nonprofit that has worked with the local Klamath tribes to use pre-colonial forest management techniques. Similar results were discovered in the Black Hills Ecosystem Restoration Project, another area where the Klamath tribes had worked with the U.S. Forest Service to thin young trees and apply prescribed burning. When the bootleg fire swept through this area, the Forest Service admitted the damage was far less than in areas not utilizing indigenous practices.
These are photos of Native Americans in Yosemite Valley, before it was a national park. Today, national parks like Yosemite are prized for being untouched landscapes, as if to say that people are separate from nature, that real nature is a place we can visit and take photos of, but ultimately leave. Recently, though, nature has reminded us that we aren't really separate. In California, unhealthy forests have collided with climate change, and it's led to a deadly situation. But Native tribes across the state, who have been stewards of the land for generations, they know how to make the landscape more resilient. And surprisingly, it involves a little bit of fire. When Euro-American settlers first stumbled upon Yosemite Valley, it looked different than it does today. There were wide open meadows with flowers. The trees were further apart.
These were not natural landscapes. These were created and curated by indigenous peoples.
This is Beth Rose Middleton Manning. She's a professor of Native American Studies at UC Davis. The settlers assumed that this is just what nature looked like on its own. But really, they had walked into a garden that was thousands of years old and sustained by Native Americans. And one of the tools that these tribes used to care for the land was low-intensity fires, known today as cultural burning. This might seem counterintuitive, right? We've seen how deadly wildfires can be, but it's not the full story.
We're burning to restore the land, restore the resources, restore water.
This is Ron Good. He's the tribal chairman of the North Fork Mono tribe, and he practices cultural burning. Fire plays an important role in keeping an ecosystem healthy. For thousands of years, tribes around the world have used low-intensity fires to renew the land. These small fires make room for new plants to grow. They release seeds trapped inside pine cones, and they also clean up overgrown and dying vegetation, the kind of thing that fuels catastrophic wildfires. But with colonization, indigenous people were forced out of their homelands.
Their land stewardship was outlawed, actually made illegal on public lands and on private lands. So I believe that's a strong contributor to the unhealthy forest conditions that we see today.
Beginning around 1770, Spanish missions across the West Coast prohibited burning. They didn't understand why Native Americans were using fire and established severe penalties for it, including death. After the gold rush, settlers were preoccupied with what they could extract from the land. In 1850, California outlawed cultural burning in a cruel set of laws that also removed tribes from their homelands. After that, there were several major forest fires in the West, which led to a national fire suppression policy.
So remember, only you can prevent forest fires.
The message was clear: all fire is dangerous. Alongside this extreme fire suppression, timber companies and foresters began planting trees in dense groves like crops. It's easy to assume that a healthy forest should be crowded with trees, but that isn't right for every ecosystem.
You have to have a segment of openness in the sense of that sunlight, rain, snow, all that can get through to the ground, to the surface.
Too many trees can create water stress, especially during a drought. It's too many straws in the ground. Plants with shorter roots end up drying out. And after planting these dense forests, people just left them alone. Trees would rot and plants would become overgrown.
Who grows a garden like that, you know? You don't grow a garden like that. You got a garden, you got to tend it.
So we had these crowded forests that started to build up with plant debris, the perfect fuel for uncontrollable wildfires. Climate change has only made this worse. The weather is getting hotter and drier. When you combine this with nearly 100 years of bad forest management, it's a recipe for disaster. By 1970, the National Park Service realized their mistake. Without small fires to open up pine cones and make room for new growth, there were no new sequoias. So they shifted course. But you can't fully shift course without the knowledge of Native tribes, who have managed the land for generations.
Indigenous people yet have been excluded from many of these conversations led by state and federal agencies and sometimes private companies that are large landowners.
Agencies are beginning to do more prescribed fires, but these are different from the cultural burns developed by Native tribes. Prescribed burns are used primarily to just get rid of the plant debris that feeds a wildfire.
Your primary focus is, I'm burning for acreage and I'm burning to reduce fuel loads. Well, that's exactly what you do. But then your land is not restored.
Cultural burning, on the other hand, is part of a longer-term engagement between Native people and the land. For example, after a burn, the ashes are raked into the soil to encourage plant regrowth. If the goal is restoration, the entire process looks different. You don't just burn and leave. That's why Beth Rose takes her classes out to learn from Ron, so they can see firsthand his caretaking process. Restoring our forests doesn't mean making them hands-off, protected spaces where nature runs wild. The forests need us to actively care for the land in order to be healthy and resilient, as Native Americans have done for thousands of years.
Many of the bushes that we're now burning haven't actually been burned for about 120 years, and they're crying. And yes, they need us as much as we need them. They need us to come out here and put fire on the land.
I want to confirm everyone sees the school picture. Okay. While the legacy of the Indian boarding schools resulted in the extinction of many native cultures and practices, many tribes did survive, and their cultures and practices survived along with them, and in many cases are being revived. The Department of the Interior recently announced new guidance directing federal agencies to collaborate with indigenous nations in managing public lands, water, and wildlife. Secretary Deb Haaland stated, by acknowledging and empowering tribes as partners in co-stewardship of our country's lands and waters, every American will benefit from strengthened management of our federal land and resources. One possible utilization of our campgrounds might be to facilitate reintegration of indigenous tribes back with their traditional land. As Suzanne Simard wrote in her book, Finding the Mother Tree, of the indigenous ideals, diversity matters, and everything in the universe is connected between the forests and prairies, the land and the water, the sky and the soil, the spirits and the living, the people, and all other creatures. Perhaps you can inquire of your camp's board of directors, if we have not already done so, to start initiating thoughtful and genuine land acknowledgements. Then reach out and contact local indigenous leaders. Request their help. They could help us reimagine our lands and partner with them to help share their knowledge. Native peoples make up 5% of the global population, yet they protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. They have for centuries been the best keepers and ecological stewards of the land, yet they have been left out of conservation conversations and investments. There may well be a treasure trove of knowledge on fire management, water management, native plant and animal management practices that we can integrate into our programs. This could also allow us to expand our partnerships with other environmental, spiritual, or restorative groups. Many of our camp boards already have a full plate of items that they're working on. And if there's no one on your board that has the time, you could volunteer to get the ball rolling. Either offer to serve on the board or request the board's permission to reach out on their behalf. So how might our sacred spaces become centers for world healing acts of prayer, cultural renewal, and ecological restoration? I'll pass it over to Joan.
Thanks, Paul. So now that we've explored some ideas about expanding our vision and our sense of broader community around our sacred spaces, we want to turn for a few minutes to looking at the process of adaptation. Scott Peck began his first book, The Road Less Traveled, with this quote, "Life is difficult. This is a great truth, one of the greatest truths. It's a great truth because once we truly see this truth, we transcend it. Once we truly know that life is difficult, once we truly understand and accept it, then life is no longer difficult. Because once it is accepted, the fact that life is difficult no longer matters." This idea helped me to see that in so many areas of life, once we come to terms with our perceptions and expectations, then we can move forward with workable solutions. And so it is with climate change action. At first, it can all seem just incredibly overwhelming, disheartening, discouraging. But once we accept that irreversible changes have already been set in motion, that the climate patterns, everything has been built around are our past, but not our future, then we can roll up our sleeves and get to work on adapting our lives to these new realities. So how do we adapt? Think of it as a long-term and continually evolving process, not a quick fix. There are low-cost changes and solutions that can be implemented very quickly, but there's also long-term strategies and changes. They are best approached with a lot of research and dialogue. The first step in the process is to learn all we can. Then we develop short-term and long-range plans in consultation with members and the local community. We're presenting a general overview here, but for each different campground and community, the most urgent threats will be different, depending on your geography and on the current layout of your grounds and buildings. But there has been a lot of research done over the past few decades into what solutions do and don't work well, and a lot of continuing innovation. For instance, in Atlantic Canada, where sea level rise is projected to be higher than the global average, there are pilot projects underway to prevent or minimize the erosion and flooding impacts of stronger winds and higher storm surges, something that was urgently needed this past weekend. There are two foundational principles behind all of the strategies. One is the need for us to reimagine what coastlines look like. When settlers first arrived on this continent, trees, shrubs, and wild grasses went right to the coast, and marshes hugged the shoreline. But we wanted to have views of the ocean from our buildings, so we cleared away the trees and brush. We wanted sandy beaches to walk on, not marshes. It turns out that Mother Nature knew best. So the second principle is that if we're able to integrate more natural elements, we'll have a more sustainable coastal zone and have a safer future for ourselves and future generations. If you have a coastal waterfront property, the first recommendation is to stop cutting the grass within 20 or more feet of the current lawn edge. As the native grasses and wildflowers begin to grow and put down deeper roots, small bushes will take hold and eventually small trees. The increasingly mesh-like root system minimizes erosion risk, and the vegetation provides a windbreak. Other solutions include creating living shorelines by planting marsh-type grasses and shrubs right into the water's edge. This creates a carbon sink that acts as a wave buffer to minimize storm surge effect. For more information about these strategies, check out CBC's What on Earth podcast titled Life on the Edge from April 4th of this year. But what about the rest of us with inland properties? Let's take a look at some resources to kickstart the Learn All You Can process. The Intact Center for Climate Adaptation has produced multiple reports and resources to help us get a better understanding of the types of changes we can make for our homes, commercial properties, communities, and wildlands. There are many reports here detailing practical strategies and solutions to investigate around heat, fire, flood, and storm. Some of the reports are a bit lengthy. For instance, the extreme heat one is 113 pages. But the good news is that there's also summary infographics for almost all of them. Paul has already suggested several strategies, but there's a quick list Susan has prepared about possible first actions. In addition, check out the Earth Stewardship resources on the seaofchrist.org website. The most beneficial actions are often those that can reduce multiple threats, such as tree canopy to reduce extreme heat effects, but also to provide a windbreak. Armed with this information, we might invite the community around us to some information and discussion sessions where we invite local speakers to come and present their experience and initiatives. We might invite an arborist to come and assess our current trees, providing suggestions on what trees might need to be removed for fire protection, what trees might need to be pruned or shaped to minimize fire risk and wind damage, what types of trees and where to plant them to provide a cooling canopy, and how best to care for our trees. Then invite Indigenous land management representatives to share their wisdom. Natural landscape experts could be invited to come and give suggestions on how to increase biodiversity and protect our trees from heat and drought. Things like creating berms, building cisterns or ponds, creating drip irrigation systems from gray wastewater, etc. For those campgrounds with limited ways in and out, this often impacts the whole community, not just us. Perhaps the neighbors might welcome a community meeting with local government officials to assess the risks and look at what options there might be to increase emergency access routes. As we learn more and broaden the discussion to include the community around us that's also at risk, we will likely see low-cost changes that we can make quickly. There's actually a negative cost to things like not cutting grass, which decreases carbon emissions and increases both sequestration and biodiversity, or eliminating things like single-use disposable dishes and cutlery, which decreases our carbon footprint and also the waste going to the landfill. Then we make our short and long-term plans, looking at what we can do in the next decade and also what we can do in the next 40 or 50 years. Most of our buildings and infrastructure will likely need to be replaced within that time frame. So let's start thinking now about what kinds of replacements will be the most disaster resilient and energy efficient, while providing comfort in times of more extreme heat. Let's reimagine the layout of our grounds to increase biodiversity and resilience. Let's reimagine our lawns as meadows, our current sewage, wastewater, and stormwater drainage systems in ways that increase capacity and provide biodiversity benefits. Let's think about what kind of roadways and parking surfaces will be most environmentally friendly and will minimize water runoff. I read an interview last week with the crowd control experts who designed the recent London queue, an amazing phenomenon of managing hundreds of thousands of people wanting to converge on a single building. Two of the principles used in the planning struck me as being applicable to what we're talking about here. The first was about planning for contingencies. First, you plan for what you expect to get, then you plan for 5 times that, then you plan for 10 times that. That's how you build resilience into plans. As we look at forming long-term plans, first plan for what the current projections are for increase in heat or drought, fire or wind or water. Then think about 5 times the projected increase and what would be needed, then 10 times. This kind of thinking and planning will help us create the most resilient strategies possible. The second crowd control principle was to keep the people informed at every step of the way. If people entering the queue knew it was going to be 14 or 19 or 24-hour wait, and it was, they stayed positive and cheerful. Everyone needs to know what to expect, what the plan is, and how long it will take. How can we keep our boards, members, and the community around us continually updated as we begin this adaptation process? As we continue to reflect on the question posed by Laurie earlier today, we turn now to Adamah, a Jewish children's camp designed to bring together environmental education and Jewish faith tradition in ways that transform lives and lifestyles. Susan is going to show you 2 clips from a camp held in Falls Village, Connecticut several years ago. Brad Martell brought it to our attention as an example of how camp programming can be expanded to address environmental issues.
Small steps, downhill. Big step up.
The strength of Judaism is that it responds to the needs of each generation. And the issue for our generation is, where are we going as a human community on this planet?
Be very careful. Well, be careful, rocks and roots all over the place. Rocks all over the place, careful.
Jewish environmentalism isn't a movement that was born in 1970 with Earth Day or even 1962 with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. This was born with Deuteronomy and with Isaiah and with Ecclesiastes.
The Teva Learning Center is a Jewish environmental education program.
Welcome to Teva. What's your name?
We're here to teach environmental education through a Jewish lens, through a spiritual lens.
Hi, what's your name?
So essentially, it's Judaism for an ecological age.
Zoe. Hi, Zoe. Welcome to Teva.
Teva is actually the Hebrew word for nature. Students come to us for 4 days from Jewish day schools throughout the Northeast. They are generally suburban or urban students. Several thousand come through the program annually.
I'm just curious, is this anybody's first time to go into like a deep into a forest?
We have parks, but we don't really go into like any of the trees or anything. We just keep on the walking area. Yeah.
Let's go. This time of year is great for learning about what's going on right here underneath my hands. Who knows what process is going on right here? Yeah?
Well, the leaves are kind of rotting.
They're rotting, and we have a fancy word.
Decomposing.
Decomposing is the word that we're looking for. Decomposition, and you can see it really clearly right here. What I'm doing right now is peeling away layers, years of time under here. This is last year's leaves, and underneath here a little deeper is the year before that.
The year before is now just dirt.
This is 3 years ago, yeah. So there's this cycle going on here, right? It's this magical cycle. It's happening all over the time. Most of us are unaware of this, but the leaves fall down off the trees. After spending a whole summer soaking up the sun's energy, they fall down and they start to decompose and turn back into what? And what are they turning into?
Soil.
And what's the soil? What is the soil there for? What's the soil helping out? The trees.
As my teacher, Rabbi Arthur Waskow, often says, English doesn't have the language for this because there's people and there's earth. But if it was earthling and earth, we'd have a sense of the Hebrew, which is Adam, human, and Adamah, land. The two are integrally connected.
Take one from each day. But it does look pretty good.
There's a Jewish law, number 530 out of our 613, that says, do not waste.
All right, now is a very, very special time. At this point in our meal, we do something called weighing the pistolet. Instead of each person bringing up their own plate, scrape all of your extra food onto one plate, and one person is going to come up here, and they're going to scrape all that waste food into the pistolet bucket.
Pistolet is the Hebrew term for garbage or waste. Kama pistolet means how much pistolet.
15 pounds minus 2, because the bucket is 2 pounds. Go ahead and put it down. 1, 2, 3. 13 pounds. So 13 pounds, that's not too bad, but do we think we can do a little better? Yeah? At your next meal, just be very conscious of how much food you're taking, and let's try to reduce our pistolet even more.
Touch. The Shema is a basic part of Jewish worship, saying, Hear, O Israel, the Eternal is our God, the Eternal is one.
That echad, that oneness and unity, take that home with you.
So we're trying to get our pistolet down. Milk on the bottom of that pistolet.
You really have to think about how much you're taking.
I didn't want to leave with a pistolet rate of like 20 pounds or something. Because, I mean, that's just not right. It's supposed to teach you to take less, not more.
1, 2, 3.
7 pounds!
Pistolet is an exercise that brings home to them very strongly the idea that as an individual, you can do a little bit that makes a huge difference when it's multiplied by the power of the community.
The last and the most important thing is what you take home with you, right? Because that's when the real change is going to happen, is when you get off the bus and you start making choices again.
And the last day we say, okay, look inside yourself and say, so what? What am I going to do differently when I go home? How am I really going to make a difference?
So you're going to fill out a brita de ma, your personal commitment, some sort of a commitment that you're going to make, an agreement with yourself, really, and Hashem about what change you're going to implement when you get home.
Brit Adama means a covenant with the earth.
For how long?
6 weeks.
The idea of a brit, of a covenant in Judaism, is actually very, very sacred.
Really challenge yourself. I challenge you to challenge yourself. Don't do something that's going to be so easy.
What about
change isn't always so easy.
organic chicken eggs?
Organic free-range chicken eggs?
Yeah.
Go for it, man, if you think you can do it. It's going to take some coordination with whoever the egg buyer in your house is.
In order to fulfill my commitment with God and the earth, I will try to eat no meat.
No meat?
Yeah.
You're going to go vegetarian?
I'll try it.
For at least 6 weeks?
I want to try it.
Awesome. I'm really proud of you. I hope you can do it.
I'm going to.
We get closer to God and closer to one another when we give things up for the right reason. We can give up our SUVs. We can give up our profligate energy use. There's a lot of things that we could sacrifice that would get us closer to sustainability, closer to each other, closer to God.
So we have about 10 or 12 minutes to begin a conversation. We were also wanting to create ongoing support. The first thing I want to ask you to do, for those of you who are comfortable with chat, is just to put into the chat. We're not going to read these all out. We just want to see them go by. What is your sacred space, your campground, your congregation, your home? What is the place that you hold in your heart that might be become a center for cultural renewal and ecological restoration? So I'm seeing some Samishes come up. Lewis River. We have representation from the Pacific Northwest, Buckhorn. And as this scrolls by, the other question is do you know who the indigenous peoples that on whose lands your camps are found? Deer Haven, Deer Park, Lokahi, Lewis River, Zion, Ontario, my home, Bluff Springs. There's been quite a robust conversation going on in chat also that I really would recommend for you. Resources on forest fragmentation and health consequences of deforestation, and a conversation on land trusts and rights of nature. Chinook, Camp Cyanito, Bluff Springs, Zion, Ontario, Ozark campgrounds. So Chinook all over. We have interactions with the Lenape people, Port Elgin, Zion, Ontario, McGowan's Lake, Samish, Kingdom of Hawaii. Somebody put in Happy Valley for me. That's where I grew up, in Samish now, but okay. So holding those places in your heart, I would like to I would like to first of all turn off my phone. I would like to invite you to put into chat something in the presentations today that has sparked your religious, spiritual imagination that you want to know more about. Just what's stirring in you. And we'll do this in chat, and then we're just going to open it up to see if we have some comments in response to the question, how might our sacred spaces become centers for world healing, acts of prayer, cultural renewal, and ecological restoration? Thanks, Rod. Parks of the Pine in northern Michigan, more buckhorn in the Cohia Nation. So just give you a few moments to just say, Okay, I'm going to let Susan start reading some of these. The places that are stirring your imagination, starting with Harold. We'll need you to unmute. Yeah.
What is God dreaming through the land? Indigenous knowledge. Outdoor school, forest stewardship for our children. Using less. Sharing Samish for Indigenous celebrations and education, including educating non-natives. Life is difficult, get over it. Buckhorn, work with Idlewild Arts Indigenous people. More camp programs on this topic. Jacob said, now I know God is in this place. I love the activities presented at the Jewish Children's Camp, especially reducing food waste, use of meeting spaces. Reaching food waste, which is 6 to 8% of human-caused climate change, feels doable. That is reduction, of course. Indigenous knowledge has much to offer us. Let's connect to it and them.
And learn from them.
Learn.
So in the few minutes, go ahead and keep putting some things in there, these ideas that are popping. Anyone have, there's just so many possibilities here that we just begin, but anyone want to speak aloud to us? And I'm going to kind of try to keep track of a couple of raised, we'll have time for a couple, 3 responses here. Those of you who took this as homework. And thought about it. Anything you would like to share, and feel free to keep going in the chat as well. Harold just put in, stop burning wood fires. It's so much part of our camping legacy. So reevaluating things we've always done. Anyone want to get a word in edgewise here? Comment I'll make while I'm searching around and waiting. Oh, there's Lori Sharp. Go, Lori Sharp.
Okay, I don't know if this is exactly what you're fishing for, but Faye Jackson and myself have begun a conversation, and this week we will be putting our 2 selves together in the same room to do some planning towards an event we already have on the calendar of October 20th at Lewis River Campgrounds to begin the practice of forest bathing or forest therapy, to begin inviting people, members and not, into that sacred space, to begin a different kind of relationship of relating to the land, not just being in the space, but relating to it and opening ourselves therefore up to God's presence within it.
Lovely. Thank you, Lori. Okay, Lori was brave and was first. I know there's ideas percolating out there. Catherine. Or are you just celebrating?
Yeah, I would love the forest bathing. Wonderful.
So I'll just mention that I participated in a cultural burning at Camp Kromberg, which is now closed, unfortunately. back when it was active, we did an annual burning, and it was in the cultural burning style. I was one of those that was raking the ashes back into the land. I also know that at Camp Kalara in Australia, I participated in, the whole camp was invited to go out and do some pulling up of the lily, the lily that is an invasive species there, and that was destroying the rainforest ecosystem. And I participated one afternoon in helping to destroy the lily.
Thank you. So I'm seeing a couple more chats, burning some small controlled fires, of course, with help at camps as a step-by-step process for people to learn a different way. Fabulous possibilities for new camping programs and focuses. You know, I've noticed how often today the word restoration has come up, and I think of us as a restoration people, and I'm really getting fascinated with another question, which is, what if our call as a restoration people is less about restoring right beliefs and more about restoring right relationships, particularly with the land and other creatures and across cultural boundaries? So I'm just really hearing that word restoration, and I want to lift that up as we have to. Unfortunately, I think if we kept going, we could get this conversation rolling, and we're not going to drop what we can do and how we can envision a new world as we go forward. But I do want to turn it over to Susan for a very special closing. And I got an amen.
Thank you, Lori. I am sorry that we need another half hour to really discuss this, but the good news is that we will have time to follow this up, and we plan to do some follow-up coming up. I wanted to share with you that several days after viewing Lori's video on the church forests of Ethiopia, I awoke from a simple but deeply powerful dream. I viewed a flat, brown landscape stretching as far as I could see. Withered vegetation and dried grass testified to the lack of flourishing life. As I watched, tiny green dots appeared on the land. It began to grow into small green forests of trees and growing things. Circles of life kept expanding, pushing back the brown, transforming the view, growing larger until they grew together and filled the land. I awoke with that vision strong and urgent in my mind. I was convinced that the small dots of green represented church campgrounds and sacred spaces that were dedicated to ecological practices and that had become sanctuaries for plant and animal life flourishing as God intended. And because of those small central locations, the balance of nature was spreading out into the barren landscape and restoring the earth. I began wondering how to create the greening centers at our campgrounds, and a possibility began to emerge for making the dream a reality. It utilizes the visioning and discernment process I presented in the June webinar. Begin with the vision of our church or campground sites as tiny centers of ecologically sound practices. The goal is not only helping to reduce carbon emissions during the everyday life of the campground programming, but also to create centers for ecological restoration of forest, wildlife, and natural resources. Pray and discern about your own specific, unique campgrounds. Prayerfully ask, what was God's intent for creation when that sacred space was created? How does God envision the wholeness of creation at my campground site in the future? Step 3, identify 3 sweeping changes that need to occur to bring about God's vision and write them down. 3 sweeping changes. But then step 4, identify 1 to 3 small steps for each of the 3 sweeping changes that make them doable. We can't do it all, but we can do something. Write down those small steps. Think creatively. Pray about what can begin to be done. Don't try to take the whole change on at one time. Step 5, identify 1 step that you personally can pursue and do it. As you become aware of other steps that are needed, write them down. Pursue the first step until you are comfortable with it, then add a second step. Step 6, don't do it alone. Connect with your mission-centered leadership and campground board. Share your vision with them and get their support. Research your local groups who could partner with you, environmental learning centers, indigenous peoples, scientific researchers, government agencies that are focused on assisting in environmental renewal, nonprofit and volunteer groups. Connect with 1 or more. Begin to collaborate, always keeping the goal in mind to maximize the campground or church property as a center for ecological restoration. Step 7, stay hopeful, stay focused, stay energetic and positive. Never give up. We will post this discernment process on our website, along with a list of practical suggestions that we've come up with, an expansion of the list that you saw in Joan's presentation. This vision of the greening of our sacred land can actually happen. We need to protect and restore ecosystems. We need change and transformation in every sector and every community. Our church resources and our tradition of restoration can become powerful tools for assisting the environment. Perhaps that is why we are the stewards of these vital lands. Perhaps we can make a small difference right there in our own backyard. If enough green dots appear, they will grow and merge, and the greening of God's earth will continue. God bless you in the effort. I leave you with the primary question. How can our sacred spaces become worldwide centers of cultural and ecological restoration? Doctrine and Covenants scripture, can you bring that up? 161 3c says, be courageous and visionary, believing in the power of just a few vibrant witnesses to transform the world. Be assured that love, going to add, and action will overcome the voices of fear, division, and deceit. Join us next month on October 16th for our exploration of actions that we can take to mitigate and to adapt climate change. We will continue the journey on Sunday, October 16th, and I think my time there for Sydney is actually supposed to be 6 a.m. because they changed to daylight savings. You will get a flyer with corrected times. Join us also in October as we begin sharing with the Beyond the Walls online worship in the Peace Moment, beginning October 30th. For 4 different Advent services, October 30th and then leading up to the Advent services, we will be doing the Peace Moment. So be sure and join on the walls, Beyond the Walls. And if you are not able to catch that in the morning because you're involved in other worship services, check it out afterwards. They always archive their services and it's available for you to see. In October, we will only have the one webinar that will continue and build on what we've done here in September. And then we will have webinars in November and December. Just watch for those announcements. Thank you all very much for being here. Please don't let this webinar slip into the past and simply become one more hour and a half of entertainment. Let it sink deep into your heart. Let it become a prompt for your action, your vision, your religious imagination engaged in creating a green dot of cultural renewal and restoration that will expand and grow wherever you are. Thank you.